Another concept from old school games that was rather important. Role-playing, by the way, is equally important depending on your play style. You can have plenty of role-playing in old school games. That's not something that's necessarily diminished, but there's a time and a place for role-playing, whereas more narrative games, you always want to be role-playing. For instance, I guess now would be a good time to talk about the responsibilities that a group would have in an old school game too. The earliest versions, and some other games, could be played with lots of people at once. And we're not just talking a group of like 6 or 7 or 8, we're talking groups of 15, 25. You might ask yourself, that would be a nightmare. How could you possibly do that? It's quite easy, really. Number one, when the action picks up, when you're in the dungeon, you would have one person who would talk to the game master. Not all 25 people, one person. They were called the caller. The caller is like the party leader. They are the final say in what the group does. Everyone else can talk to the caller and plead their case for what gets done, but ultimately the caller says what the group does. And the assumption is, and the general trust people have to have in the caller, is that they're going to be looking out for the best interests of their characters, because play is going to take place as the caller demands. Now, if a caller does a really bad job, that may change, and if you have a smaller group, the caller might not be as important. But when you have a large group, it's essential to keep things going with any kind of speed. And honestly, to get through combats, speed is essential. And of course, because you have so many people, the creatures that you could go up against could be very great in number as well. So you want to be able to get that done quickly. And a caller would be essential for that. If you can imagine for a moment having your actions dictated by another person who's only going basically by your advice on what you'd like to do, that can be scary. But it was the way that you could play with so many people. Another assumed role of responsibility was the mapper. One person would often be, and sometimes more than one, would be responsible for listening to what the game master would say, and they would write out a map showing where they had traveled to. Overland, that might be just putting a denotation in the hex that they're in, but underground it might be, you might make it as elaborate as you want. For some people it's just kind of a flowchart showing what room connects to another. But the best mappers could put together an actual map, an overhead view map, which might actually reveal likely places for secret doors or hidden areas in a dungeon. And you could use those to figure out more of the secrets, rather than just passing by the same secret door without any hint that there could be one there. This was often a valued skill in any group. A caller was essential. If your caller ruthlessly put people's ideas down and just trampled over the group, that didn't work out very well. If your mapper was subpar, you could really get lost fairly easily, and then the game master is not obliged to help you out. If your maps aren't good, well, you get lost, something happens, your torches go out, and by the time you get your light, you're in a strange area. They can't help you. That's not their job. Another role that's common is timekeeper. As I said, have things happening on a schedule. Your torches run out. You need to eat so often. You need to drink so often. A timekeeper can alleviate some of those needs for your game master. Some game masters prefer to do that themselves. They have a tracking chart that takes care of all that, but sometimes you will have a player that will take care of that responsibility too. Again, something that you really want to trust somebody who's very good at detail, because otherwise you'll lose track of how the resources are supposed to be consumed. And if you're really lucky, you might have somebody in your group who steps up to be the scribe, the person who writes down the details of what happened. Let's face it, this is a hobby where it's an audience of only so many people at a table at a time. Those are the people who get to watch and get to participate and get to enjoy the story. Not everybody's games are streamed for posterity's sake, so immortalizing those things by writing down deeds and records is a great way of showing respect for the group and a desire to add value to everybody's experience. Something that I enjoy doing for my group is just doing recognition videos of what went on, both to keep it fresh in my mind and also so the players can look back on what happened and go, oh yeah, I remember that. So those responsibilities are something that are unknown in most modern games, almost all of them. These days it's all about having smaller groups and spending more time on role-playing coming up with your character's motivations and goals, and having a story that has a beginning, middle, and usually an end to it, where the characters do something about something. Not so much in an old school game, which generally tended to be more wide open, and the players would often be going by rumor or some element that would drive them to adventure. So another thing that's important with old school games is because things are relatively bare bones from what the game gives you, what you give to the game, you usually will get back. If you're a player and you do more in a combat, you say you don't want to just move forward and attack. Instead, you decide that you are going to give a little narration when you get your opportunity, and you say you're going to feed the orc a punch under its jaw and then slash with its sword. You've just given the game master something that he can lean on so that he doesn't have to rely just on his combat foo. But if you roll well, he might actually, hey, you clock him under the jaw, which sets him up for your slash with the sword. It helps his narration, and he'll often, or she, will often appreciate the effort that you put into making the story yours. This also comes into play when, well, quite honestly, it keeps the game lively and exciting when you do more than just, I move forward and attack, I cast my spell at the idol. Things like that are, worksmanship level. You're possibly doing your job just fine. But doing with a bit of style, a bit of flair, instead of just moving forward, move forward with a war cry. Instead of attacking in a shield line, maybe your character will go over and flank so that maybe he can get in those back rows against those archers. Sometimes a little bit of unorthodoxy can really help to bring out the exciting parts of a character. It adds a little bit of opportunity for role play, but also it lets you just try things, and sometimes trying things is more important than I move forward and attack, especially when you look for opportunities to engage with the environment to the advantage of your character. And that is an important thing, again, when we're talking for the game master, making areas that are designed to be manipulated and played with, that also includes environments that can be used by the players or by the adversaries to their advantage. This helps to create interest, this helps create a sense of tactical superiority, and when the players learn to take advantage of those things, it can really help swing the odds a little bit more in their favor when there's a whole world coming after them, it'll seem. So those kind of things are absolutely essential in old school to make the game come to life for you. It's not just the game master's responsibility to come up with all the details. Sometimes as a player, you have to push a little bit to get a little role playing in, to get some clever ideas of your own in, especially if you're rewarded frequently for doing smart, cool ideas and gameplay. So then we also will then have to come to your gear. Now, oftentimes the lust for magical items is pretty evident. Magical items are cool. Special items are great. However, neglecting your basic everyday items is kind of a foolish idea. First of all, of course, remember the Donner Party. You want to make sure that you have enough food and water to last you where you're going. You want to make sure you have enough light source to carry you where you're going. If you have a means of keeping track of where you've been, make sure you have enough of it. If it's just chalk, make sure you have a bundle of it. If you're leaving a trail of twine, make sure you have a couple spools of it. And if you don't do that, you're going to have a bad situation at some point. But even beyond that, thinking of all the different ways that you can use even basic gear. For instance, I thought of 30 different uses without trying very hard for a 10-foot pole. Most people think, well, yeah, you can use it to dump on the floor, and you can use it maybe as a pole vault to get to a higher place. These are all true. But what happens if you combine the use of that pole with other things to make it more useful? You can kind of use it as a lever, sure. But I can also cut it up into 4 2.5-foot long clubs that if we come across a rust monster, we don't have to risk our swords, and we can still use effective wooden weapons that we don't have to worry about losing. If there's a height, a 10-foot wall, I can cut notches that I can put the sides of my feet into to climb up using my 10-foot pole, to at least give me a better chance of scaling that wall rather than just relying on, brute strength or athletics. That gives me a boost. And that's, cutting a notch into one end of it, so if there's something distant, I can hook it and drag it closer to me. These are all very, very basic ways of using a very, very basic item that could cost you absolutely nothing if you go out into the woods and cut your own 10-foot pole. So these are the kind of things that are the essential advantage that keep a person alive in an old school role-playing game. Other things are more obvious. Caltrops, for instance. But a lot of people, when they're in a situation where they really could use those caltrops, just leave them in their backpack. Caltrops could be used whenever you run away. Slow whatever is chasing you down. Caltrops can be used if you have to have a choice between two corridors. Leave them in the corridor behind in the choice that you didn't take, so that if something comes following behind you, you might hear them yelp. That's just the basics. There's a ton more. A bag of marbles. Why would you use a bag of marbles? Oh, they make the floor slippery. Yeah, but if you're in a room with an invisible creature, you can put the marbles on the floor and watch the displacement and know exactly where that invisible creature is. And that's just the most basic uses of these things. I'm not going to get into a detailed description, but your basic stuff is as much the key abilities of your character, because you don't have lots of flashy abilities in this game. So you've got to use all the things that you've got going for you. There's a couple other tips here that Mr. Finch gives, and I very much agree with all of them, so we'll give those out real quick. View the entire area you've mapped as a battlefield. Don't just look at it as a chamber at a time, because odds are your enemies aren't. They may have home field advantage and may be familiar with all the different rooms. They may use different chambers to outflank you, to surround you, to cut you off. And then where are you? So if you look at the entire area as a potential battlefield, you can react to a changing environment much quicker. And also, you can exploit different features in a dungeon scenario and leverage those advantages against your enemies, sometimes defeating them without taking any losses for yourself, which is the ideal way to get through any combat scenario, is to get through it without expending your own precious resources. So, establishing things like rendezvous points, where if the party gets separated, where to meet up. What is the strongest defensive location? So if you have to shelter, where can you go? And then if you do, that's when you use caltrops too, to make sure that you have another thing to impede your enemies. That's where you should, for instance, use other things that you carry with you to block areas, to deny your enemies access to you, so that you can get a measure of safety in a hostile environment. Eventually there will be magics that compensate for all of this, but in an old school game, these things are important. Scout ahead. Remember, combats are dangerous. Even trivial combats are the more dangerous because they waste your resources and generally have little pay. You're there for the pay. Remember that. You're not there to kill everything. A person who goes through to kill everything is often going to be exhausted, and likely by the time they get to a creature, they just run out of steam. Be smart about how you fight. Scout, but don't scout stupidly. Don't send one person up way out of range of your light and unable to call back for help. You may be very confident as a thief. You may be invisible, for instance, but still exercise some caution when you do simple things like scouting. But yeah, avoid wandering monsters. Get in, get out as quickly as you can with as much treasure as you can, and you'll be much happier and have a much better success rate. Killing every monster often is not optimal. And quite honestly, too, this is where the role-playing aspect comes in. Some people think there isn't a lot of role-playing. Honestly, if you meet up with a monster, most of them aren't eager to die. Human adventurers and dwarves and so on can have a reputation of their own of being dangerous. Not all monsters are going to be eager to face against your blades and spells. So therefore, maybe a demonstration of strength might stop a fight. It's certainly possible. Or you might even be able to befriend somebody. A little bribe, maybe some food, maybe some coin, might get you out of a sticky fight wherein, had you fought it out, you wasted some spells, or you took some extra damage that you didn't need to take. So you'll have to leave the dungeon earlier, or you'll have to have increased risks going forward. You can see that's not optimal. So that kind of play is really what separates good players from mediocre hack and slashers. Don't assume you can defeat any monster that you come across. This is essential. There's often a number of creatures in any game that are unbeatable from the means you're likely to start out with. There are creatures like golems in Dungeons & Dragons. They're very hard to take on. They can do a great amount of damage, and very few things can hurt them. Well, what do? Oftentimes, try not to get into fights with them. Many of them will have a determined way that you can get around them rather than have to fight. After all, somebody created them and put them there. They may have some means of bypassing their own guardians. So think more so than just go charging in. And for goodness sake, in one of these games, never fight to the death. You may lose some people. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes you didn't retreat fast enough. Sometimes a series of unfortunate events do happen. Death can come for anyone. But it's a foolish party that charges forward and fights and fights and fights till they're all dead. One of the most common complaints game masters have for modern players is that they always assume that every encounter is fair and balanced and has a way for them to beat it. Don't assume that in old school games. That's not the case most often. Go through with caution, and if nothing seems to be working, fall back, retreat, run away. 4, keep some sort of map, even if it's just a flowchart. The mapper is useful. If you don't have a designated mapper, doodle something. But generally, if you end up, through some trickery, end up getting turned around, a great mapper can really help you out. I can't stress how useful that can be enough in an old school game. 5, ask lots of questions about what you see. Most often, the description you get is just going to be very bare bones, just what you notice upon first entering a room. It's up to you to find all the details out. What's behind that shadowy corner? What's on the ceiling? Look up. Always look up. That's where traps come down. That's where ceiling ambushers like lurkers and giant spiders come from. Always look up. But even beyond up, look at all of the different features in the room that the game master told you about. Many of those are there. Remember, Way of the Moosehead, Ming Vaz, many of those are features, and they are going to hide something or give you a clue to something. So make sure you take a look at those. There's no skill to just roll and see if you observe it. So make sure that you poke into those things. Be curious, but also be cautious. If you have to go rifling through some random moldy furs, might think about doing it with a stick so those rot grubs don't get into your skin. If you're looking at that shiny green stone, you might want to wipe it off first with maybe yesterday's tunic so you get the contact poison off of it. These are hard-earned lessons that I can tell you. It's true. So, be cautious, but be curious. It always pays to be cautious, but it usually pays to be curious. Testing floors. Being careful about the environment and asking for details about things like that. Those are just very simple ways of going about. And if you can test something without exposing yourself to risk, poking with that floor, taking a weight and rolling it down the floor, something like a bowling ball, for instance, rolling it along the floor to spring tripwires, or maybe spring pressure plates. Not a terrible idea. I mean, even if there aren't bowling balls around, you can always find a smooth rock. 6, protect the magic user. He'll eventually be your nuke. True. Magic users are very weak in the beginning, but down the road, they are certainly worth preserving. Even though it takes them forever to level up, once they get up there and they're throwing fireballs around to solve your problems of being overwhelmed, once they're able to throw up walls that can control your enemies and make the battlefield just the way you like it, they are extremely important. And that's a reason why good fighters die to keep them alive. Because eventually, they will be the soul of getting by many, many challenges. Also, always protect the healer. Always protect the healer. Even if your healer is somebody who has some of the best armor, and they want to be up in the front line, as soon as they start taking damage, send them back. Because they are the ones who keep everything else going. If a fighter goes down, you could probably still survive. The cleric goes down, you have to pull back immediately and get another cleric in most cases. So the cleric is also essential. 7, hire some cannon fodder. It's a little heartless to think of people as being expendable, but quite honestly, your characters are the heroes. So hiring a couple of people to stand alongside of your fighter means that he's not taking all of the impact. And also, make sure that you get smart cannon fodder. For instance, having a shield line is great. Having a couple people up front to take shots, give them some chainmail, maybe give them a shield, give them some melee weapon, spear, mace. You know, that doesn't matter as much. Have them up there with your fighter anchoring the line. Great. But also, think about getting a couple of archers. You can use your archers, even if they don't do a great amount of damage. And many of the weapons for archers aren't all that great. You know, light crossbows seem terrible. But you can shoot them every round that you're not being tied up in melee combat. So if you can shoot at distant foes a couple of times before they close in, you're efficient. And you have just proven the value of that crossbow. You can hit distant foes if they might not be able to hit you. Total superiority. Every character should have a means of fighting in just about every theater. Wizards, magic users starting out, should carry daggers and darts. Something, so that if they cast their spell, they can still contribute. Every time. Thieves, especially, get a bow. Do something, rather than just, I'm sizing up for my backstab. Every round that you're not participating that doesn't have a really big payoff, again, you could have possibly hit a couple of times in that intervening and help swing the battle. But it's especially important for fighters. Make sure you have a couple of weapons that can hit in a variety of ways. You're trained in most weapons, or have the ability to. Make sure one of them is some sort of a bow, some thrown melee weapon like spears or axes, and of course your melee weapons. This just makes sense and keeps you efficient across a wide variety of situations. And again, standing around or just spending a round advancing is almost a wasted round. The most efficient parties are the ones that win the most often. Let some of those hirelings, let them have bows and direct them. Shoot their archers. Shoot their spellcaster. You're going to really appreciate those hirelings after a while. You don't have to give them great armor. Just say, hey, if somebody's coming up to you with a weapon, run away. But if they stop chasing you, turn around and shoot them. Always keep them busy. The ones doing your front line are great. But what happens if you hire some lesser armored guys with longer spears that can poke at foes behind? It was a solid tactic all through the Dark Ages, the medieval period. Spearmen backing up your front lines from the Roman days and earlier just makes sense. Get as many attacks in on your opponent as you can. Hit them from missile weapons first to weaken them, and then when they get close, exercise superiority in battle. So important in old school games when, again, you could die the moment you hit 0 hit points in the right game. So these are battles that can often be won before the actual hand-to-hand attacks start. Spears can usually reach past your first rank of fighters, and they can be thrown as well. So hireling spearmen is a great idea. Even if you're fully confident in how good your fighters are, yeah, that's a good idea. Check with the grizzled one-armed guy at the tavern before each adventure. He may have some special lore to remind you of. And yes, also expect that guy to lie. There may be false rumors, and sometimes relying on them can be absolutely devastating. But it's really, really important to use all of your advantages, and that includes informational advantages too. So, that is my take, my suggestion on old school rules games. This is, as far as I'm concerned, fairly definitive. If you play a game like first edition D&D, you don't have to play old school style. You really don't. You can just play where the game master makes intelligence checks to see if you see things, or wisdom checks to see if you hear anything, and that is rolling and seeing if you roll under your stat. There have definitely been people who've done that over the years. You can play that, you know, to get a trap, you need a thief. and don't really look for the players to try all these different things that I've just talked about, yeah, you can do that. But this style of play can leverage skilled players. That is, people who get a real sense of accomplishment out of conquering challenges, because it's not that you rolled well, it's not that you have a great build, it's that you beat that dungeon, you defeated that trap, you outthought that scenario. It's a game about personal accomplishment more so than just your character doing something cool. Now, don't get me wrong, characters that do cool things are great, but it's much less about getting a cool character up to maximum level and such. It's more about testing yourself against challenges again and again and again. And another thing that was kind of a peculiar phenomenon, I think, was back then, there often wasn't an impetus to get your character as high as possibly able. A lot of times characters would retire. They would get up to a certain point, then, okay, we're going to take another fresh group into the dungeon. That wasn't uncommon. So oftentimes when a character would hit their name level, or 9th or 10th level in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they would retire. They would go and build a tower somewhere, or build a keep, and push back some of the chaos and create a little bit more civilization. And maybe they would get rich as a landowner and have their own small little army, and then maybe grow it out into a kingdom. This was all things that could often be done without actually, rolling and maintaining. Later on, they codified all this stuff for people who really got off on kingdom building. But it was about the struggle. And when it stopped feeling like such a struggle, it was time to retire that character and start up a new character and have the thrill of that vulnerable period of time where it's your skills that really made the difference of whether or not your character lived or died. Proof that this style of play is still popular and that the idea of vulnerable characters, just look at games like Dungeon Crawl Classics with their classic funnel system of creating characters. We make lots and lots and lots of zero-level characters, throw them into a dungeon, and any who crawl out to survive are first level and can then go on. People enjoy that style of play. This style of play has not gone away. Even though it's not the most common anymore, there is reward behind this style. There are devoted people who still enjoy this style of game. And of course, there are going to be people who are going to come in and are going to go, well, what's all the fuss about? Or they might be curious about where the games came from. What were their roots? And if they're like me, they're interested in how they've evolved. Where they came from, where are they going, and what's the next step? But old school style was a game for the players to do something really cool, allow their own skills and abilities to transfer into their own successes, still telling great stories. But it didn't necessarily have to be about saving the world or defeating a great demon or a dragon or something. Oftentimes it was about surviving and thriving in a hostile environment. That's the heart of old school. And quite honestly, I hope that this video inspires some respect for this style that sometimes I think is sorely lacking. Some people only think this is for hidebound people who just never looked at later editions. I have, and honestly, I find this to be just as worthy of a play style as any other. And if you master some of the skills required to play in old school style games, you can always use these skills in any game that you play. If you go out of your way to say, for example, in coming into a room in a more modern game like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I'm going to look at the various plays, here, there, and everywhere. At the very least, you'll probably be considered for advantage because you're doing the exact thing that is called for that to succeed. In the worst case scenario, a GM will shrug and just let you make a roll. Okay, that's fine. But one of the beautiful things about running in this style is that it flows so quickly because so often you don't need rolls. You just need to trust your game master is going to make calls, as are required for the game, to keep it interesting. And everything I said about game mastering, all of those are so useful for running games that are interesting, engaging, and will grip your players and keep them, even if there's combat and combat and combat. The players will still be there and keep their interest engaged. So, this is old school. This is a way of playing role-playing games. For some people, it is their best way of playing role-playing games, and for others, maybe not so much. But it is a way, and hopefully you at least try it if you haven't before. I am making this for a group called Benchley, Dale, and Beyond, run by the Dungeon Master Tim Connolly, a fine man, and runs a crazy game, but never boring. And they play in this style to this day, and there's many, many others. I highly recommend you, at the very least, try it out. A lot of these games aren't hard to find. And a lot of the games that are coming out are a lot of retro clones have come out, and new additions to these retro clones. Games like Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry, Crusader Kings. There's just a vast number. I can't keep track of them all. Basic fantasy role-playing game. These games can allow you for very little, and sometimes free, in the case of basic fantasy role-playing game, to download it for free. Try it yourself. Get a couple people together and just run an adventure. Dungeon Crawl Classics just put out a new edition with lots of pretty books and all kinds of resources to play. As much as you want to delve into it, this is here for you if you're interested in the consideration. And I hope that all the stuff that I just talked about gets you excited, gets you in the mood to lace up your boots, put on your armor, grab your 10-foot pole, and look in all directions so that you don't get surprised the next time you try old school gaming. I'm OmnusI. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, game on. Thank you.